All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. On behalf of the National Child Passenger Safety Board, we're happy to have you here today for the CEU webinar, Child Passenger Safety, Traveling from the Scene to the Hospital. Today's speakers are National Child Passenger Safety Board members, Scott Downing, our board chair, and Fire EMS representative, and Marie Snodgrass, our healthcare and injury prevention representative. I'm Brittany Lombard. I'm the Child Passenger Safety Advocate on the National Child Passenger Safety Board. We do have planned time to answer questions at the end of the presentation, so please go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box. As a reminder, attendees are requested to not participate in this webinar if you are operating a motor vehicle. The webinar will be recorded and you can listen to the recording when you arrive safely at your destination. The recording will be posted to carseateducation.org within 1 to 2 business days. For the child passenger safety technicians in attendance, this presentation qualifies for one continuing education unit or CEU. Attendance on this webinar is required for at least 45 minutes for the CEU credit. Proof of attendance will be emailed 24 hours after the webinar. When entering the CEU in your SafeKids profile, this is a webinar/teleconference, and all required information will be found on the proof of attendance email. Please join me today in welcoming our speakers.
All right, Marie, you're on mute still, but here we are.
That's the best way for me to be. This is going to be the best presentation for you, Scott. You get to do it all.
Oh.
You can see everything. I'm sharing good.
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. All right, I'll start, I guess. As Brittany said, my name is Marie Snodgrass. I'm the Injury Prevention Program Lead at C.S. Mott Children's Hospital at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I'm also the Injury Prevention and Healthcare Representative for the National Child Passenger Safety Board.
And I'm Scott Downing. I have 25 years in the fire service. I'm currently a fire captain on a ALS engine company. I'm also the chair for the National Child Passenger Safety Board, and I represent the fire EMS side on the board as well. I've been doing child passenger safety for a lot of years, and we've done similar presentations in the past. So hopefully we've freshened up a little bit. If you've seen a similar one, a couple years ago, we've tried to freshen it up a little bit. So yeah, here we are.
Awesome. Just to touch on our objectives that we're going to try to hit today. We're going to hopefully you're going to leave today knowing the best ways for assessing the scene of a crash and how to relay the information at handoff with a trauma team for best possible transfer of care, exploring considerations and recommendations for best and safest transporting of patients, pediatric patients specifically. Discussing safety misconceptions when it comes to transporting pediatric patients, identifying potential hazards, and sparking some conversations to help guide SOPs and SOGs. So with that, I'm gonna let Scott give us a view of the scene.
All right, so the role of the first responder really is to provide life safety, incident stabilization, and property conservation at the scene of a crash. So during a motor vehicle crash, we start out with a brief arrival report, that kind of paints a picture for incoming responders. It starts that thought process as far as mechanism of injury and how significant the crash is. And, are vehicles on their tops? Have they rolled over? Is there moderate damage? Is there significant damage? So it gives incoming agencies, other responders, kind of paints a picture for them to understand what's happening and start creating that incident action plan as to, who needs to be plugged into that, what the objectives are, and how are we going to assign tasks. Companies arrive on scene and they assess for hazards. They use apparatus to block roadways, create safe work zones for the workers. And then it's about life safety. So we're assessing the condition and number of patients. We're going to create that incident action plan and address the incident needs and order additional resources as required. People like law enforcement or the Department of Transportation, additional ambulances, etc. A big thing that we want to take away from that is that mechanism of injury, and that's kind of that mechanism of injury describes how, with what force, and on which part of the body the injury occurred. If you think back or you remember back to your CPS training, think about those stages of a crash, the vehicle crash, the human crash, and then the internal crash. So that information helps determine the likelihood of a serious injury, and then what emergency care might be needed, or what things we need to do as emergency responders. So the mechanism of injury is not the same for everyone. It depends on all kinds of different factors. Some of those might be age, our littlest patients, but also our elderly patients. What kind of health conditions are we in, or what kind of health problems do we have? And then a big one, is restraint use. Are we using restraints properly? In specifically, do we have kids in the right size seat for the stage that they're in? Something that we talk about in EMS is the golden hour. So that golden hour in emergency medical services is that first 60 minutes after that traumatic injury. Kind of the sooner we can get someone to definitive care, the more likely that they'll have a good outcome. So, it's kind of been thought of as kind of a good goal, a 10-minute scene time, and then getting the patient to the hospital as quickly as possible so that we can provide care that they need so that they have a better outcome. And then, we're extricating, we're looking at the most serious patients, and we're going to get them out of the vehicle the quickest and get them into ambulances for transportation. And we're helping those ground ambulances or air ambulances, if a helicopter comes in, to get patients prepped, and off we go, and then passing off what findings that we found for them. Sometimes it's really appropriate to transport the patient in their car seat that they're in to help limit further manipulation of that patient. Those car seats can provide great immobilization, and they also provide pretty good access to the patient. So some things that we do on the scene.
So from there, we at the trauma center or at the hospital are needing the information that Scott just talked about, all the information that was assessed on scene. We need to receive that at the hospital. And as you can imagine, there are numerous people on scene. There's the first person on scene, so the first responders. So that might be Scott's team that's first on scene. It could be police, law enforcement that are first on scene. Often it's bystanders that are first on scene, right? And bystanders add a different level of complexity because they want to be helpful. They want to come in and make sure everybody's okay. When they see a small child, what is the first thing they usually do? They take the child out of the car seat or out of the vehicle. Sometimes they'll try to console the child, or they'll try to help by consoling the child or children. And so that's the first thing they want to do, right? Is they want to remove the child from the vehicle so they can console the child, which, as Scott just said, sometimes the best thing for transporting and for keeping that child stable is keeping them in their own seat. So that can become a problem. The handoff is really important from the responder to us, but there is so many, or from the transporter to us, but there have been so many people involved that transporter hopefully got the right information, but we don't know if they got all the information, right? We don't know that they saw how that child was restrained in the vehicle. We don't know what they saw, if there was a car seat. We don't know if they actually saw which vehicle, how many times it rolled. There's a lot of pieces of information that we're going to ask at the trauma center or the hospital to try to get the full picture. The details are crucial. And we talk about it being a real life telephone game, right? It's that whole, when you start whispering in this person's ear, is it going to be the same story when it gets to that person 4 or 5 people down the road? So we want to make sure the best we can that the accurate information is transferred. But us at the trauma center, we're going to ask a lot of questions to try to get to the details. We're going to do our best to try to get as many details as we can, because what we're trying to do is predict injuries. and we're trying to figure out at that handoff as much information as we can. So we'll get information sometimes. We'll have somebody tell us that the child was restrained or appropriately restrained. But what does that mean? What it means to me and what it means to somebody who's never had children, who's a 19 or 20-year-old transporting a child might be very different. What it means to me and somebody who's never been a technician may be very different. So there, a lot of questions there. So we try to ask a lot of details. When you say they were appropriately restrained, does that just mean they were sitting in a seatbelt? Does that mean they were sitting on a booster seat? Do you know, were they in a harness seat? What position? Were they in the front seat or the back seat? There's a lot of questions that kind of will come with this. A lot of times too, we'll ask for pictures. Did you have any pictures? Did you take pictures at the scene? Pictures can tell quite a story for us. And so the more details that we can get, the more helpful. So it's very, very important. And the other thing that we really try to stress too to anybody transporting in at that time of handoff is requesting a timeout. So if you are a first responder, if you are somebody who maybe is in that trauma bay or you're at that hospital when that is happening, that handoff, request a timeout. Have everybody stop, have everybody go quiet. We need to make sure that information is relayed accurately and in a way that everybody is hearing it. When there's all that chaos and all that commotion, sometimes details are getting missed or getting forgotten. So we want to make sure that everything is being heard appropriately. Here's an example of a really important detail. So somebody might tell me he was in a booster seat. When I hear that somebody is in a booster seat, this maybe is the picture that comes to mind, right? I think of a booster seat. I've been a technician for 20 some years. I think of a booster seat as a belt positioning booster seat. Now, they might think of a booster seat, whoever is relaying this information to me, as just a car seat. They might just use that term for all seats that kids sit in. They might not realize that there's a difference between a harness seat and a booster seat that uses an adult seatbelt and doesn't have a 5-point harness. But would you ever think, you might if you've actually heard me present this before, would you ever think that you would see this as a booster seat? Because we had this on scene at one of our crashes, and had the responder not taken the picture and showed this to us, I probably wouldn't have believed it, but this was the booster seat that was in the vehicle. So booster seats can mean a lot of things, and the details are really important. So we want to make sure that we're getting as much detail as we possibly can. And so just kind of a few more details about the hospital transfer. It's kind of important to remember, the hospital traumas, pediatric traumas for hospitals, are pretty low volume. Even for like a trauma center, like we don't see a lot of like high intensity traumas that come through here. But just because they're low, we see a low frequency of these cases doesn't mean that we shouldn't be prepared. So they're high intensity, high risk patients, but we don't see a lot of them. So we have to be ready for them, and we have to be ready to, be able to handle them when they come in. But it also means that it kind of raises everybody, adrenaline goes up, everybody is kind of, reacting and might be kind of spinning around a little bit. So we need to make sure that we are all hearing everything and we're all on the same page and we're getting all the details that we need. The details can have a major impact on the prediction of injury, on the early tests. We want to make sure that we're getting all the things that we need to get done for these children. A lot of times these kids are nonverbal, right? So we might not be getting all of the details. We may not be getting from them, where you can ask an adult, where does it hurt? Does this hurt? Does this hurt? Show me, point to it. Tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is it? Kids aren't always going to give us all of those details. So we have to presume on our end that they are injured until a physician clears them. So until they can get in to get the x-rays, to get the CT scans, the MRIs, that's what's going to help us determine the presence of and severity of injuries. So we need to make sure that we can, in the meantime, we can get as much detail from our responders to be able to, and our transporters to be able to start to predict and start to put together some of the puzzle pieces, until we can get all of these tests started and get all of these details to start to fall into place for us. So that's what we're looking for on our end. Now we're going to kind of go a little bit backwards. So we've talked about scene of the crash. We've talked about coming to the hospital. And now we want to talk a little bit about the transporting to the hospital. There is a little bit of a misconception out there that emergency vehicles are safe. They should be safe, right? They're the ones that are transporting these vulnerable people, patients to the hospitals. But they are not passenger cars, and they have many potential hazards within the vehicle itself that we need to be thinking about as they're traveling at high speed sometimes to get patients from point A to point B. We also have currently an absence of consistent standards and protocols that tend to complicate the work of our EMS professionals. So we don't have across the board, I'm in Michigan, Scott's in Oregon. I like to say that we do everything the same way here that they do out there, but it's just not the case because we don't have a set of national standards. Now we're working towards that, and Scott's going to share a whole lot of that information with you right now. But until we get there, it leaves a whole lot of open-ended issues that we're still kind of working on right now. So we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those are, because there is a strong potential to improperly restrain highly vulnerable pediatric patients within these rigs and within these vehicles. And we see them a lot. And what we try to do on our end is make sure that we communicate back with any of our transporting agencies and try to work with them and take any opportunity we can to be a learning experience and share information back with them when we have any of these experiences that Scott's going to share with us, to be able to learn from them and find ways to improve the way that children are being transported. So just a couple things to touch on, a couple things we're going to touch on. Seating arrangements, not always the most convenient and not always the easiest to work with, depending on what we find at the scene. There's been a lot of vehicle modifications to fit different equipment and different things inside these vehicles. We have a lot of unrestrained equipment and crew within the vehicles themselves. And then there's always the potential, they're moving at fast, at high speeds, and there's always a potential for crashes with these vehicles as well. So these are all things that we're going to touch on right now and kind of talk about ways that we can hopefully mitigate some of these things. I'm going to turn it back over to Scott.
Yeah, lots of things to think about and consider. And like Marie was saying, there's not necessarily a national standard that things are being brought up to, or that we're seeing across the country. So in different areas, different regions, you might see different standard operating procedures. You might see different ways that people do things. So I'm going to speak more so to West Coast and to what we're doing in Oregon. And I will share experiences that I've, meeting people on a national level that we share some of those experiences as well, and hear what they're doing in other places. But what are some of the hazards in an ambulance, right? So there's just a ton of equipment. I think about the fire engine that I run on, and my gosh, how much stuff can we put in a compartment? We did a critical patient transport just my last shift, and there's 3 providers stuffed in the back of a pretty small ambulance with the patient. It was a pretty substantial breathing difficulty, and we just got a lot of equipment out, whether we're trying to start IVs, get them on a monitor, we're delivering a CPAP and giving albuterol treatments and those kind of things. So lots going on in the back that there's just a lot of stuff going on back there. So incompatible seats. You know, when you look at that picture of the back of the ambulance, it's a bench seat. And so most everything would be sitting in there lateral. You know, we're not facing forward, we're not facing the back of the rig. Really, in most ambulances, there's an airway seat that would be positioned behind the gurney towards the front of the vehicle. And that's really the only seat outside of being on the gurney that faces forwards or backwards. Everything else typically is side to side. So can I put a car seat on that lateral bench? Probably not. Okay. The loose equipment we've kind of touched on, providers and passengers. You know, we try in my area really if we're going to take a family member along, we're going to put them in the front seat up with the driver of the ambulance so that they have a seatbelt and that they're restrained. Sometimes we're putting an adult in the back, you know, mom or dad or caregiver might go with the child in the back, but we're going to make sure that we're utilizing seatbelts for them. Oftentimes we put them in the airway seat because it has typically the better restraints than say just the bench seat. Other vehicles are an option, right? So when we think about transporting children who maybe don't need medical care or they don't need, they just need to go along because maybe mom or dad was injured in an accident, you know, utilizing a different vehicle, putting them in their car seat in, you know, a supervisor's rig or utilizing law enforcement or some of our partners is often a good choice. Code 1 versus code 3. So code 1, no lights and sirens. We're going to obey the same traffic laws as everybody else versus code 3, where we got lights and sirens on and we're kind of causing havoc going through the roads. It's crazy to me with, you know, everybody goes through driver's ed typically, and you learn when you're learning to drive and you read the owner's manual or the manuals when you get your driver's license, what your laws are in your state. And we're pretty consistent with the laws, you know, that when a emergency vehicle is coming with his lights and sirens, that we're gonna slow down or stop. We're gonna pull to the right. We're gonna yield for them to get by us. I feel like no one does that when we're responding code 3. So code 3 becomes a pretty high risk evolution because other drivers are unpredictable. So, you know, code 1 versus code 3 in the county that I work in, very, very rarely do we do a code 3 return, meaning that the ambulance might come code 3 to the call. We'll do incident stabilization of the patient, get them packaged up. And then oftentimes, even with a pretty serious patient, we're still going code 1 back to the hospital because it's a safer way to transport that patient. So lots of hazards in those rigs that we're using. So we can go to the next slide. If we're in a crash, what happens after the crash? So, you know, I would describe it as a yard sale. All that stuff we just talked about. Are those compartments going to come flying open? All the stuff on the shelves in the bins, that loose equipment that's not restrained is going to fly around in the back of the rig. And it's the same message that we give parents about projectiles in their vehicle, right? So again, it just reinforces the fact that we really need to be cognizant of those things. We're not anticipating being in a crash, but it happens. You know, I was probably 2 years ago, we responded to a medical call. We cleared the call. The ambulance had left just prior to us. And before we even got back in quarters, we got dispatched to a motor vehicle crash just a couple miles from where we were at. And so we responded. And when we showed up, to our surprise, it was the ambulance that we had just helped package up a patient, put in the back. And they had hit a big black cow that had wandered into the middle of the highway that they didn't see. It was pretty late at night and dark, and they ran into this big black Angus cow. Significant damage to the ambulance, and you know, there was some minor injuries that occurred to the practitioner in the back of the ambulance and additional to the patient. So we had to get another ambulance out and transport. So it does happen that we have those crashes. So it can become a yard sale, and all that stuff can move about the back of the rig. So just some stats about when ambulances do crash. Again, it's not, you know, this study, I think 2017, I think is the numbers where these came from. but 4,500 crashes. In 34% of those, some of those, I'm just going to grab a couple of them, but 34% of those crashes resulted in injury of some sort, with 33 people getting killed. Okay, these are preventable things, a lot of them. 84% of providers, the EMS providers, not restrained. So we're working in the back of that ambulance. We're not in a seatbelt. We're just loose in the back of that box. So again, if there's a sudden stop or a collision, or even just the driver trying to avoid a crash and he hits his brakes really hard, that's going to send that provider flying across the back of that ambulance, potentially hurting himself or the patient that's strapped to that gurney. And then 44% of the patients were ejected from the cot. That picture shows, the use, more of a correct use of restraints on a cot, but typically you have, one around the lower legs, one around the waist, one around the chest, and then the two that go up and over the shoulders to help prevent them from sliding and going off the cot. I'm always amazed at how often those restraints are not used properly. They're not snug down to the patient. We're not putting on the shoulder pieces because we're going to do a 12 lead or we're going to do some kind of intervention. So it does happen. Even with our pediatric patients, sometimes we're not getting them fully restrained. And so that's where we want to step in and make sure that we're doing the best job that we can. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get going on. So what's our desired outcome, right? So what are we looking for? We're trying to create some awareness. How we can do, kind of follow that good, better, best, but what do we want to do? We want to make sure everyone's protected. So if I get injured in the back of the ambulance, I can't provide care to the patient that I'm taking care of, and that's going to bring another resource out of the system to take care of me and to take care of this patient that got injured because I wasn't restrained, or I wasn't using my restraint, or we slammed on the brakes and we were in a near miss or maybe a collision, and it caused some of us to become injured, and now we're part of the problem. So we really want to make sure everyone's protected, doing the best we can to provide equipment being secure and providers being secure and our patients being secure on that gurney or cot. We want to prevent that forward motion or ejection. We don't want people coming off, we don't want to be part of that 44% that were ejected from the cot. So we want to make sure we're using those harnesses or those seat belts that are secured to the gurney appropriately, and that they're over the patient appropriately, or if it's a pediatric patient, that we're using a restraint appropriately that's designed to be used with that gurney. So we want to secure the torso. We want to protect the head, neck, and spine, just like we're doing in CPS. And then ultimately, if we can meet those goals and we're doing the best we can, the outcomes for the children when transporting from the scene of that crash or that medical emergency, we're going to see increased, less injuries, and we're going to see better outcomes for them as we move through. All right, we talked a little bit about good, better, best, and we talk about it in CPS quite a bit. So we want to strive for best, right? We want to do the best we can. Sometimes there's limitations to that. So we're going to do what we can with what we have. Sometimes, depending on the needs of the patient, sometimes that's going to limit us as far as being able to restrain them or those kind of things. But ultimately, we want to strive for best. How do we do that? Some of the things that we can do, we can make sure that everyone and everything is secure. And this might be doing an evaluation of the units that you use to respond in, and back in your agency. Or, maybe you're not a first responder. Maybe you have a friend or a colleague. A lot of CPS happens within fire stations or with law enforcement, so there's good contacts. But what do those systems look like? And are we doing things? Do we have restraints for monitors? Do we have oxygen bottles that are secure? Are we speccing ambulances that have restraint systems for everyone and for those practitioners in the back to be restrained? So everybody, the patients and the practitioners in the back should be restrained. Equipment should be secured. Are we looking at the way we dispatch units to these crashes in a way that, are we sending the right resources, the appropriate resources at the right time? Ways that we can limit, are we giving them the right response modality? Is it a code 3 call? Is it a code 1 call? Man, I see our ambulances show up a lot of times because they don't get the same information on their screen in their unit that I do. So I'm given a lot of latitude as a company officer to really read into the call notes and make some decisions whether we should be going lights and sirens, because it is a higher risk way to do it, and it creates a lot of confusion amongst other drivers and potentially could cause a secondary crash while we're responding to an incident. So can we head that off at the dispatch? Can we start there and make sure that we are giving good information to those people who are responding so that they can get to the call safely? And then, like I was saying, I have a lot of latitude whether we use lights and sirens, and then what time of day. I'm not using my lights and sirens at 2 a.m. Because there's not a lot of traffic. But at 4 p.m. during rush hour, when everyone's headed home from work, sometimes it's necessary to create some awareness so that we can get to where we're going efficiently and get through the intersections, and we're using lights and sirens. So decision making on the part of those drivers and officers. And then another thing to think about is, non-critical children should be transported in another vehicle whenever possible. So creating relationships, whether it be with Health and Human Services in your area, or law enforcement, child welfare programs oftentimes are good about transporting kids around. That's what they do, and they have car seats that are available. And those people who are driving those vehicles understand how to use those car seats. So that could be a great partnership. To be able to, you go to a home or you go to a crash, and mom or dad, that caregiver is sick or injured and needs to be transported, but the child could be taken to the hospital via that other partner to meet up with mom, and we're going to do it in a safe manner. So looking at supervisors' rigs, law enforcement, a supervisor who doesn't have police shields and things like that, that make it hard to transport in. But thinking about that ahead of time, I think that's the key, is creating those practices ahead of time so that we can, when we need to do it, we've already made those arrangements. So we're not searching at the last minute to try to figure those out. All right, what are some misuses that we see? So there's some examples of some misuse. We're putting a rear facing only car seat on a rear facing seat. That's the airway seat. So now that child is essentially forward facing. Is that seat going to operate as it's designed? No, that's not how it's engineered to be used. And really, there's not a good way to use that seat in that in the back of that ambulance. That maybe we're looking at putting it in a different vehicle to get that child to the hospital, or using something different if that child needs medical care in the back of the ambulance. That next picture, we ever see maybe putting that child in the front of that ambulance, there's an airbag there. So, or maybe we have a law enforcement rig that has a cage where the car seat won't fit in the back, and we'll just put it up here in the front. Well, that's inappropriate use of that. So that would be misuse. Here's an example we talked about a little bit, but an improperly restrained patient. We're not putting the gurney straps over the patient where they need to be. That patient is set up to go, a hard break, and that child's going to come up over the top and potentially be ejected off that gurney. And then a big no would be lap sitting. We're not going to put, mom on the gurney and strap mom down and then have mom hang on to their kid. As much as they want to do that, that's a super, super unsafe practice. So, common misuses. Also, I think not using an adjunct for a patient. We don't have a picture of that, but maybe we're just putting a little tiny one, a little on a gurney, and those gurney straps aren't going to work. It's very similar to putting your 3-year-old in the back seat and just putting a seatbelt around them. Is that going to work for them? No. We need some sort of adjunct, be it a commercial product or a conventional car seat, to help that gurney system fit that smaller child. So those are things we need to think about with misuse.
So when
All right.
these are examples of when we as a trauma center will give information back to the transporting companies, use these as learning experiences that hopefully we don't see come through again, but we'll communicate back, our trauma program manager or somebody on our trauma team will communicate back with them after the patient's been transported and just give some feedback to say, this isn't a safe way to transport. This is what we would recommend. If you have any other questions, follow back up with us. We can provide training or, any other information for you that you might need. So we always try to be a resource for them. We've actually done training with our survival flight crew and provided, actually we helped them purchase, we didn't provide them for them, but we helped them purchase convertible car seats so they have the appropriate car seats to use when they go out, in the event that there isn't a safe option for them to remove from a vehicle or to transport a child. We want them to have the right type of car seat that they can, transport in if they need something. So those are just some ideas, for those of you that work in hospitals or trauma centers. But just to, instead of being frustrated, make sure that we try to take those opportunities to teach and provide resources and information back to these people so that they can learn from them and, try to do better.
Yeah, there's lots of opportunity. Maybe you're fire based and you have a private ambulance company, and if they don't have appropriate restraints for kiddos, maybe that's an opportunity to meet with their supervisors and say, how can we help you develop a standard operating procedure, and how can we help you with training, and how can we help you to do better? Because like Marie said early on, these are low frequency calls that oftentimes are high intensity, or there's a lot of risk associated with them, and we don't see them a lot. So we want to be prepared ahead of time. All right, NHTSA put out a recommendation, dates back to 2012. It needs some revision, to follow along. But really, we want to talk about what we believe or what we think is best practice along with this, and hopefully at some point we get some science based facts behind it as well too. So some of the options that are out there for securing pediatric patients, commercial harness systems. Some of the manufacturers of gurneys, Stryker, Furno. This is a Furno PediMate pictured up there on the gurney that is designed to integrate with the gurney or the cot, and then provide appropriate sized restraints for those smaller kiddos, and they're adjustable. There are also maybe gurney manufacturer specific systems like this. We have a set of these on one of our ambulances that we use in reserve, but they're color based. So each, it's like a vest that would go on the child, and they're color coordinated, and there's an age and weight range, kind of similar to what we would find on a pediatric kid or a Broslow tape, color coordinating for size. And then the fixation points or the attachments have to be, looped onto the gurney at strong parts of the gurney, and then they buckle in once we get the harness on the child. So those are things that are out there. Integrated seats. Some ambulance, just like vehicles, still come with integrated seats. Those seats would have to be spec'd and purchased ahead of time when you're purchasing or replacing ambulances. And then of course we have conventional car seats that we're all familiar with and that we can use in the back of an ambulance. So commercial devices, we talked about that PediMate, and they're devices that are going to attach to the gurney and are the ideal way to safely restrain a child in an ambulance, right? So we're going to create a securement piece that's going to fit the size of the patient that we're dealing with. Again, it's going to require training on the part of the EMS provider. We have to have those available. The fixation points have to be pre-attached typically to the gurney, and we have to be able to get those things out. So it can slow or delay our response, our return back to the ambulance. And they just looking at the weight ranges, anywhere from 5 to 99 pounds. And of course, we want to follow those instructions. So becoming familiar is important. All right. I think convertible car seats. So this is the one we're going to be able to use on a cot, is a convertible. And that convertible is the only one that we're gonna use. This is the only one that's recommended for use on a cot, because we're using both the forward facing and the rear facing belt pass to secure that. So we're using, you can kind of see in the picture, it's hard to see, but the upper seat belt that would go around the patient's chest is going through the forward facing slot. And then the one that would go over their hips or the waist is going through the rear facing belt path. And we're cinching that up good and snug, just like we would in a vehicle. So that would be what a conventional car seat might look like on a cot. And it's using both those belt paths. Integrated child systems, just like in vehicles, they're not super common. And I think, you know, there's a pretty narrow age and weight range for a lot of those to fit the child and work with the child. And typically for this, it's going to be a child they might be sick, but they're not really requiring much intervention to be able to ride up there. Of course, if they need more interventions, then they're probably going to be the patient that ends up on the gurney. So something different to use in that. But those are, you know, if you're at an agency and you have influence over ways that we can transport kiddos, this is something to look at that probably it's not going to add a huge cost at the time we're specking out those vehicles or ordering new ones. So, and of course, always want to read the manufacturer's information in there. I know that I can't think of it off the top of my head. I can't think of the name of the ambulance manufacturer, but working on a bigger scale project with ambulances and transport of pediatrics, they were actually looking at integrating lower anchors into the back wall of the ambulance and the bench seat, so that you could use latch to actually affix a car seat on the bench in their vehicle utilizing latch, which I thought was pretty cool. So those are things that potentially are out there depending on what kind of ambulance that you're speccing or using. So, and then alternative transport options. We've talked about this, and I think the biggest thing is creating partners ahead of time, be it, you know, Child Protective Services, be it law enforcement, be it your supervisors, but understanding, having a plan ahead of time is super important. And again, it would be for a child who doesn't require any medical attention on the part of the medics in the back of the ambulance, that we could do that. All right, so those NHTSA, those are kind of the adjuncts that we're using, and we're going to kind of look at the ideal piece, right? So these are, there's some different scenarios here. This one's for a child who is uninjured or not ill. And so ideally what NHTSA is saying is transport them in the appropriate size restraint in another vehicle other than the ground ambulance. And then it kind of gives some options. You know, if we can put them in an appropriate size child restraint in the ambulance, you know, it kind of goes down that good, better, best. Best being, hey, let's do it they don't need care. Let's put them in another rig and we'll reconvene with mom or caregiver when they get to the hospital. So that would be the ideal situation for a child who is uninjured or not ill. Situation 2, a child who is ill or injured and whose condition does not require continuous and or intensive medical monitoring or intervention. So they're sick, they're injured, they're going to ride in the back of the ambulance, but they're not needing a lot of care. We're going to make sure that they're in an appropriate size child restraint, and we're going to secure them appropriately to the cot. So that's going to be those kiddos that can still fit in that convertible seat, that we can use the forward facing belt path and the rear facing belt path to get them secured in there. And you know, typically, and we do this a lot, you know, we go on a kiddo who maybe they had a febrile seizure, and we've managed that. We've got their temperature down, and now we ask mom or dad, you know, caregiver, hey, does your child have a car seat that we can use to transport? And then we go through that process of getting the car seat, getting it secured to the cot, getting the child in the car seat, and transporting. So that would be the ideal scenario for that child. For a child whose condition requires continuous and or intensive medical monitoring and or interventions, then we want to transport that child in a size appropriate restraint that complies with 213 and it's secured appropriately to a cot. And so that's maybe where the Furno, the PD Mate, or something like that is, whatever the ambulance the transporting ambulance company has chosen to use, but we want to make sure that we're using that's going to allow access for IVs, for airway, you know, to be able to monitor vitals and do those kind of things on that with that child. Maybe not so much a conventional car seat in that case, so that we have better access to provide those interventions as we transport. So, and then it kind of breaks down maybe some of those other pieces as we go. And then situation number 4, for a child whose condition requires spinal immobilization or lying flat. So maybe, you know, this could be that child that was involved in that motor vehicle collision, and we need to do some C-spine precautions. We got them on a C-collar, we put them on a board. We want to make sure that that child is on an appropriate size spine board. We carry a PD board, which is adaptable for little tiny kids up to a pretty good size kid that may not fit on an adult size backboard. And we want to make sure that that is the board. I think the big thing is making sure that the board is secured to the cot, as well as the child secured to the board, right? So we're not just securing that child to the board and putting the board on the back of the gurney and then taking off. Because again, if we make a sudden stop or involved in a crash, now we got this poor kid, you know, that's strapped to that slick spine board, and they're going to shoot them right off that gurney because it's laying flat, and they're going to become ejected off of that. So ideally, we're using an appropriate adjunct, so a pediatric sized board that fits that kiddo, and they're restrained to that, and that board is restrained to the gurney itself. All right, situation 5, a child or children requiring transport as part of a multiple patient transport. So maybe a childbirth, or we're on an MVC and there's 2 or 3 kids in the back. So if possible for multiple patients, transport each as a single patient according to the guidance shown for scenarios 1 through 4. So depending on the size of the system and availability of rigs, sometimes we will call for a second ambulance or a third ambulance, depending on the system that you're working in. And each patient has its own provider and its own ambulance, so they can be restrained on the gurney, kind of like we talked to 1 through 4. So if not, for mother or newborn, transport the newborn in appropriate size restraint. And maybe we put mom in a different position within that rig. If they're critical patients, again, I think best practice is going to be call for a second ambulance so that they have their own care provider, and we can make sure that they're restrained appropriately. So that NHTSA, you know, that's easy to go back if you want to look at it and kind of walk through it. Just if you Google the NHTSA recommendations for ambulance transport, that guidance will come up. So it's that safe transportation for children in emergency ground ambulances. That's an easy one to find, those best practice recommendations. Understand that there's a lot of unanswered questions. It's a lot based on theory, what we believe to be correct, not a lot on the science, or, you know, we're not really doing crash testing with child restraints in ambulances. So, and there's not a lot of documentation for some of that. You know, we don't always see the results of crashes or incidents that happen because maybe they're not being reported. You know, there's small sample sizes, those kind of things. So again, it's a lot of what we believe to be best practice based on what we've seen from testing in automobiles and other vehicles. So that's a big piece of that. Let's take a few minutes and let's talk about where do we go from here, right? So what's next? What's the next steps? So, you know, you take this information back to your agency, and hopefully it spurs those conversations, it spurs questions. Maybe you take a more critical look at the system you work in, and how are we transporting those patients, those pediatric patients, back to the hospital. That helps drive the conversation at different levels of, you know, what is our standard operating procedure going to be? What kind of protocols do we have? What kind of systems do we have in place, and building those out ahead of time, doing the training, making sure that all the partners are familiar with the process. You know, for us, because we have a private ambulance company that provides that ambulance service within our county, as the fire department, we respond, we stabilize, and then we pass it off to those ambulance people. We need to work together. So, that training should involve both agencies so that everybody's on the same page and we can work together to provide the best outcome for the patient. So consistency and working towards getting some consistency amongst agencies. We have a lot of control over what we can do at a local level. We can have some influence at a state level. And then we're working hard to create some consistency at a national level through developing recommendations similar to the SNHTSA recommendation for best practice trainings like we're doing today to help spur those conversations and kind of get people on the same page. I've been working on over this last couple years on a project through the National Association of State EMS Officials, the SIMSMO, say that 5 times fast. That really it is a development of an SAE or an engineering document to outline crash testing recommendations for adjuncts used in an ambulance, be it for a supine patient, a patient that maybe might be in an isolette or a box, for preemies, or in a seated patient. So 3 different groups, 3 different documents, and that ultimately the hope of that document is to create a recommendation so that we can crash test those devices, be it a manufacturer specific like we talked about. The example was the Furno PD made or a commercially manufactured device to restrain kids on a gurney. It might be where a car seat manufacturer might want to certify or test and see what their convertible seat, how it reacts on a gurney. Do the gurneys, can they support that? And really put the science behind it. So coming up with that document's been written and sent off to the Society of Automotive Engineers to kind of go through it and critique it and criticize it. And then the hope from that is that document comes back and then we can go to the next step, and that's actually putting it to work, getting a crash sled buck assembled and putting these adjuncts on it and running it through a crash testing process and doing the measurements. Can those adjuncts limit the head excursion and the movement and keep the patient where they need to be, like we think they can? And then hopefully the end state is that becomes the standard. And then just like car seats that are used in the USS, they meet that FMVSS standard. Potentially at some point there could be a standard for the use in the back of an ambulance. So and then looking at specifications for ambulances, what kind of things can we do when we're purchasing ambulances or we're buying ambulances? Some of the work needs to be done on the ambulance side, and like I mentioned earlier, the specific manufacturer that is forward thinking, and they're like, hey, we could take and we could put lower anchors in our ambulance on the back wall, and reinforce the seating area there by the back wall so that we could put a car seat in a forward facing position, or we could put a rear facing seat in a rear facing position in that back corner of the ambulance so that we could create an opportunity for a multitude of different car seats to be used in the back of this ambulance for non-critical patients. So that's the next steps. That's where we're going. That's where we're hoping to go. And we'll continue to do work and continue to push the agenda forward because we want to create a safe environment. I think to Gordon Graham, he retired California Highway Patrol. He was an attorney. He did a lot with risk management. And one of the big things I always took away from his talks were, if it's predictable, it's preventable. So we know these things are happening. There's things we can do about it. We just need to take those steps to do it. So that's where we're headed. Those are the next steps.
All right. I love those little Lego people of you two. Let me switch over to Q&A here because we do have some great questions. Give me just a moment. Yeah, lots of good visuals in the presentation. So thank you so much for all of that. And lots to look forward to in the future as well, which is very exciting. And now I lost my question panel. So again, give me one more second here, bouncing between screens. Oh,
You need
why
some
is it not?
help, Brittany?
Yeah, it's not going to show me the Q&A.
Yeah,
I
once you share
apologize.
screens, you lose all freedom in Zoom.
Perfect, perfect.
So I'm just going to go down the list in order. The first one says, I am a lead tech and oversee our car seat safety program at the hospital I work for. After multiple attempts, our EMS department doesn't see value in talking about CPS. The perception is that proper use isn't the priority when EMS is involved. Do you have any suggestions for her to continue to navigate this challenge?
I think it's that conversation too, critical patients versus non-critical patients, and that determination, sick or not sick, that initial assessment. And kiddos that are not sick, we really should be following best practice and doing the best that we can to provide that safe transport. And then using some of the data. There's not a lot out there, but that when ambulances crash, that's a study that was put out, and there's some good information and numbers on there. Just like that one stat, 84% of practitioners are not restrained. So using that kind of information, and finding the right person that is passionate about it, that you can spur that passion and light a fire, might help get some SOPs or SOGs within your system.
I always feel like it's good too to have somebody like Scott, or have somebody that's, a CPST or an instructor, who also works in the field, because we specifically talk about that good, better, best, right? I mean, we know that we want to strive for best, but we know that when you're out in the scene, like, you're faced with some just crazy situations that sometimes you have to deal with what you're, the hand that you're dealt with, and you gotta act with less than ideal, circumstances. So not every time can you do the best, and you kind of have to just do the best you can with what you got. So having people that are, used to being out there, that know what happens on scene, I think talk with those people, it comes, it's a lot better than me, who's never been on a scene maybe, and has never had to respond to a, a fatality on, a crash scene with fatalities and all this crazy stuff, and say, well, this is what you need to do. I don't want to tell somebody else how they should do their job. So I think somebody who does the job can maybe sometimes come across in a better way.
All right, we have our next comment is, do trauma centers still teach the safe travels for children in EMS class? And are EMS teams being open to learning this information?
We have not given it in quite a while, but we have offered it to our survival flight team here, that do air, they do helicopter, fixed wing, and ground, and so we've offered it, and they've they need pediatric CEs, and they're often looking for them. So it's something that we've offered, and it's something that we can continue to put out there. So, I mean, I don't know, we haven't done it since before COVID, honestly, but it was something that was well received from our teams.
Excellent. The next one's a comment. It's saying that several states have specific education for officers and deputies so that they can be part of the solution and engagement strategies. And I just wanted to share that out to take a point to promote car seat basics for law enforcement on the carseateducation.org learning portal. It's a really great way for not only law enforcement, but other first responders to have a basic training on car seats, and they're able to have a group delivery format so they can log who completes that module. So just wanted to share that for agencies who have not thought about using it in that way. The next question, how would you secure a rear-facing only seat to a captain's chair that uses a 5-point harness for providers?
That's a super good question. Whether it can be done or not, I couldn't tell you that. The one thing probably, some of those captains are the airway seats spin around, right? So we don't want to put just like in that picture, I don't want to put a rear facing seat in a rear facing seat, because now my child is forward facing. So some of those airway seats can spin around to that forward facing position, so that a rear facing only could go in that, provided that there's ample room in front of it, from cabinets or those kind of things. So with the 5-point harness, I couldn't tell you we would have to look at that specifically and see what the manufacturer recommends for that seating position.
And then before we go on to the rest of the questions, because we have several more and I want to get to them, but let's close out the slides. We're at the top of the hour, and that way we can make our final announcements, and then people, they can go if they want to go.
Beautiful. So we will do more questions at the end. For now, before you go, we have a few closing announcements. We really hope that you're enjoying our webinar series. We are having a lot of fun delivering them. Hopefully you will join us in April and May for 2 new CEU webinars. We have the Adaptive Transportation Needs and the CPST, and Learning with the Latch Manual, Strange But True edition. So you can register for those at cpsboard.org/webinars or scan that QR code on your screen. And also importantly, the 2026 National Child Passenger Safety Award nominations are open. Please nominate a technician, instructor, or team that inspires you to go above and beyond in your community. The nominations are due by August 31st, 2025, and you can visit cpsboard.org/awards to nominate someone today. This webinar recording will be posted to the carseateducation.org learning portal within 1 to 2 business days. For the child passenger safety technicians in attendance, the presentation qualifies for 1 CEU. Proof of attendance will be emailed 24 hours after the webinar. You must enter the webinar information into your profile at cert.safekids.org to receive the CEU for recertification. All of the information you need for your profile will be found in the email that you receive from Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a safe day, and thanks for all you do to help keep child passengers and their families safe. And we do have time, I think, for a couple more questions here, so we can go back to Q&A. And Kendra, I don't know if you want to keep the recording rolling for the last few questions.
I'll keep it recording, and then when we post it, people won't have to watch all the questions.
Perfect. Now I have to find the question panel again. Oh, there it is.
Good luck.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think this one's a good one. I'm jumping around a little, but I just saw this one and I had the same question. So Nicole says, there's been mixed messages regarding those emergency contact stickers that go on car seats. What are your thoughts on them? Do first responders know to look for them? And do they use that information to get the child to an appropriate person if the adults in the vehicle are unable to communicate that information?
So interestingly enough, we had our state conference, and there is a member of the MACPS who is in our state, and she was on our planning committee, and we were going to have somebody be at our conference, and she said that the manufacturers do not allow for them to be added to car seats, and so we did not have them. So yeah, so that was like a new twist that I hadn't thought of, was that we are adding stickers and altering the seat, and the manufacturers don't want us doing that. So that kind of added a new little curveball for us. We were told that a lot of people don't know to look for them, and so it wasn't like something that consistently was being that people knew to consistently look for or use. I don't know, Scott, if you have any like thoughts on it.
I'm going to say that probably not, that they're not being trained as a majority of responders to look for those kind of things. What we do teach in EMT classes is looking for like medic ID bracelets or those kind of things. If people are incapacitated or they're altered where they're incomprehensible, you can't understand what they're saying. We're looking for those kind of things to identify allergies or medical conditions, but not so much, it's just like the pet inside sticker on the door, right? I'm probably not going to notice that, but that's ingrained in me that, I'm looking for your pets. If I'm in a smoky environment, I'm looking for your pets too, as well as your people. So more than likely, if it's important information that you want a responder to have, they're probably more likely to find a emergency ID, a necklace or a bracelet that has, I'm diabetic or those kind of things on it. So
Excellent.
not so much.
Sorry, we got curious people here. Lots of questions. What does the NCPSB think of the Aegis device?
I'm not familiar with
I
that.
can tell you
guess.
that the National Child Passenger Safety Board does not have a statement on that device. I also don't know what it is. So if Scott knows what it is, you're welcome to tell us. But the board itself does not have a position statement on it.
And that
Yeah,
was
and like
AEGIS. We can look into it and maybe connect with Adam offline. Is there any specific data on the pediatric restraint devices in ambulances that exists?
specific data, like I don't believe so. You know, a lot. Again, there's not a lot of testing that, or a lot of documentation of those in crashes. You know, there's not a lot of ambulances that crashes. What was it, 4,000 some odd crashes were documented in that 1 year. So there's not a lot. Again, the hope is with an engineering document that we develop a process so that those things are being tested, and we put some science behind, are they actually working, or do they do the job that we think that they're doing when we're using them on a gurney specifically, right? So.
Excellent. Scott, you mentioned that a convertible car seat is the only car seat that should be installed on a cot. Can you talk about why we wouldn't use a rear-facing only car seat in a rear-facing direction?
I think that it's a recommendation because they're using both of the restraints on the cot to restrain that car seat onto the cot, right? So you're using the forward-facing belt path and the rear-facing belt path. So I think it boils down to just you know, dynamics, crash dynamics, and how that's going to work with the seat belts and the potential maybe for the head of the cot. You know, if it's flat or not flat, you know, that's part of how that probably is helping hold the seat on there. So, but because we don't have a lot of data, you know, crash tests to see how it works, that's the recommendation, and that's what they're using for that, is that convertible seat.
Perfect. There's a question asking if someone's trying to support their volunteer-based EMS team and wondering if there are any specific funding or grant opportunities for car seats in the EMS space that you know of.
Again, regional, right? It's going to be very specific regionally. I know in Oregon, through our Department of Transportation, the regional safety people within ODOT, there are mini grants, you know, so it's pretty, it's not difficult to write a grant, and it's you know, monies that are available to be able to purchase car seats and things within a program. So, you know, you're gonna have to look locally into where you're at and what might be available. And I can't speak to other states, but I would hope that they would have similar programs to have money available grant-wise to help those kind of programs.
I believe AAA has funds or grants you can apply for like supplies and educational funds. And I believe that there's stuff that's very specific to like law enforcement and responders, like equipment and educational materials.
Excellent.
Yeah, and a couple of years ago, I wrote a grant. Walmart does a lot of local stuff through your local Walmart store. So, you know, they have mini grants that you can produce. And I got $500 from a local Walmart to purchase seats for a program. So that's another, you know, their Walmart is all across the country. So that might be an opportunity to look into as well.
Absolutely. Marie, if you want to answer this one, I'm happy to share from our hospital perspective as well. But Diane is asking, how do you suggest getting your local hospital on board with ensuring newborns leave the facility in a car seat?
How much time do you have, Diane?
I was going to say that could be a whole webinar in itself.
Yeah. I'm gonna share my email address with you, and we might want to have a call.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit more than I can. There's a lot of politics and a lot of things that go into it, and it's taken some time, I'm not gonna lie. And we don't actually have a written policy. We've got some guidelines, but it's not the easiest. It depends on who you've got at the top and, you know, all the players in the game. But I'm happy to give you my email address and give me a call, and we can set up a call, and I'd be happy to talk with you.
And Diane,
Excellent.
you can find Marie, Brittany, Scott, all of our emails on cpsboard.org. Just click board at the top of the menu at the top there, and you can find Marie under Injury Prevention Healthcare Representative.
And I think that is really the bulk of the questions. There's a few comments if folks want to read through a few responses about the Aegis device. And it sounds like it's actually a baby wearing device maybe and not a child restraint device. So I think recommendations probably don't include that at this time. But yeah, lots of good information, people sharing things in the comments. And I think that's it for today. So thank you all so much for joining us. And Kendra, I'll have you go ahead and close out the webinar.